I'm Matt T. I'm the Permanent Secretary for Government Communications. And this is a session about why communications is crucial to the development of good policy. And actually, I would extend the title and say why communications is essential to good delivery. To some degree, this is a presentation about my career. I am a communicator. It's what I've spent most of my career doing. But in common with most communicators, in government or outside, I don't actually have a formal qualification in communication. It is an interesting thing, I think, about the profession that I lead in government, that most of the people within it do not have a degree in marketing or public relations. And actually, probably, we bias our recruitment towards more general graduates than to those with specialist communications degrees. And while I am a communicator, I've done significant policy and delivery jobs in my time. For 2 years, I was responsible for the NHS star ratings. So I was compiling indicators and all of the work that needed to go on with that, and became the least popular man in the NHS while I had to deliver the bad news to hospitals. I'm still not allowed into Newcastle. Was the Chief Executive of NHS Direct for a couple of years. So I've done a bit of both, and I think I'm a better communicator for having done some work in policy and delivery. So what's this session about? Well, it isn't the usual exhortation from a communicator to policy and delivery colleagues to work more closely with my people. I think communications people need to step up to the mark, and when they step up to the mark, they're given access around the table. And I mean, I would say to you, get closer to my people, but I'd also say to my people, you have to meet with policy and delivery as equals and not be adopting a subservient position. For me, it's actually about the breakdown of some of the ways that we've traditionally seen some of the roles within government, but actually outside government as well. I first came into the civil service in 1998. This is my third stint in the service. And when I first came in, it wasn't quite true to say that the way the relationship between policy and communications went was that a Director General would come up to you with a white paper and say, please write me a press release. But it wasn't far enough off that. It was quite similar to that at times. And I think we've moved a long way on from that. I think we're now in a position where what happens is that communication people are involved much earlier on in the development of policy. But I think looking to the future, it's going to have to go even further beyond that. And that's really what my presentation is about today. I think we're now looking at a time where, as policymakers, you will want communicators involved in really quite tough questions about the policy we develop, because how those policies land, the acceptability of those policies to different stakeholder communities will be absolutely crucial to how we develop the policy in the first place. I also think we're getting into, increasingly, a space where policymakers and delivery folk are increasingly communicating directly with citizens, particularly with some of the web channels that we've now got. And that communication is now supported by communicators and not done through communicators. And I think that puts policy colleagues into an interesting and new space where it's a different relationship with communicators. So let me take that forward a bit. The role of communications. I sort of see this in three ways. And all the time that I talk about communications, I'd like you to understand that I guess I mean it in two senses. I do mean communications in terms of what professional communicators within government do as their day jobs. But I also mean communications in the broadest sense. I mean that sense in which communications is part of all of our jobs. So we are the voice of government, informing and engaging the public and stakeholders. I think that's pretty much a given and has probably been abidingly true for ever and ever. Secondly, and increasingly so, I think it's about achieving outcomes through behaviour change in partnership with policy and delivery. And as I say, I think that relationship is changing. And in case we think that behaviour change is anything new to government communication, I think if you go down to the museum downstairs, you can see some very early examples during Second World War and well beyond before that of government trying to achieve outcomes through behaviour change. And thirdly, and I think this is very much increasingly so, I think this is very much plays into some of Gus O'Donnell's agenda about modernising and professionalising the civil service. For me, what the role of communications is about making government work better. When I first came into the civil service, I worked at the Department of Trade and Industry. I came in from having done a comms job elsewhere in public service. My absolute expectation was that a big part of my job would be liaising with communicators in other departments in order to communicate what government was doing. And it just wasn't true. It just wasn't what I did. DTI didn't speak to anybody, nobody spoke to us, and we weren't on our own. Departments didn't speak to departments. We got together as heads of communication once a month, but it was really an information sharing session. It wasn't about how we worked together. Now, for me, in the years that have followed, I think we're now much better at cooperating as departments in order to achieve communication. But I still think it's quite rare that we communicate truly effectively as government and that we work together as government. I think it's really interesting that Gus O'Donnell, in a speech he gave to the Institute for Government recently, put forward the idea that we might allocate some, if not all, of the government's resources according to priorities and objectives rather than departmentally. And I think it's absolutely true to say, certainly if you look at the communications area, that very little of the money that gets spent is spent in a truly cross-government way. If you take the Frank drugs advertising campaign, which is shared between departments, it's one of the few examples where even having a shared PSA has led to shared spend on communications across departmental areas. So, our challenge, cross-government working as citizens engage with government, not departments. I've talked a bit about that already. Providing opportunities for involvement, participation and co-creation. I think we've always, as government, engaged with citizens around the development of policy or the delivery of services. We are finding, particularly with new channels, that there are other ways of doing that than the ways we used to. But even then, we're also finding better ways of liaising and engaging with citizens in a face-to-face setting. Some of the deliberative work that the Department of Health did 4 or 5 years ago around Our Health, Our Care, Our Say was really innovative, and I think got a real richness of citizen communication, citizen engagement that hasn't been present in some of the engagement work we've done before. And policy and delivery and communications working in partnership to develop effective strategies. And I'll come back to this theme again, that all too often I think we have a communication strategy which somehow is supposed to sit separate from a general strategy for achieving a particular departmental objective. So, the changing landscape. Way back, and I don't mean that way back, I mean I'm probably only talking 10 years ago, and actually probably very specifically about 12 years ago, broadcast communication and passive audiences. I think that the Labour government in 1997 didn't invent the idea of being ruthlessly in control of the message and of ensuring that that message was conveyed through channels with a very clear script and delivered in a very effective way. But it was probably the point at which it was the most effectively and ruthlessly done out of government. I think we've seen a number of changes since then, which I'll describe as we go through the landscape. But back then, we expected our audience to receive. We didn't expect to engage with that audience. We weren't particularly interested in engaging with that audience. Second step on that journey, public engagement, two-way communications, and the citizen as customer. And I think we've come a significant way down a journey, but it's still very variable across government. I think now, when we are communicating, we are expecting an engagement with the public, partly because particularly with the internet, the public now have the ability to voice their feelings about the things we're talking about in quite a public way. If you just take, actually something we've helped to enable, if you take NHS Choices, as a patient in the NHS, you can comment publicly on the service you have received from an NHS organisation, NHS hospital. That is a way of making citizen feedback, citizen comment more public than we have done very much before at all. And the idea of citizen as customer, I think, is worthy of a whole discussion on its own. And I think, I know there are people, certainly World of Health, where I came from, where people are uncomfortable with the idea of patients as customers. But I think if you think about it from an attitudinal point of view of how we seek to develop our policy or to deliver our services, I think the idea of customer, the idea that people should have legitimate expectations about how we behave towards them, the idea that we should build our policy and our delivery around them and not around our interests and our convenience is really significant. And the third step on that journey, which I don't think is a done deal at all yet, is the idea of interactive public service delivery and citizens as partners. When I ran NHS Direct, one of the things that we were struggling with was the idea of how could you actually live up to a promise that you shaped your services around the feedback that you got from your patients. The mechanisms by which you got that feedback, the way that you translated that into clinically appropriate ways of delivering service was all something we aspired to. We had the right words, but actually delivering was much more difficult. And I think this theme that I want to get across today about how some of the boundaries between communications and policy and delivery are breaking down to an extent is very true. As NHS Direct, I think we were able to communicate a principle quite well. Living up to that principle, the principle that our patients shaped the services that they would receive, was much, much more difficult. And the danger of communication being split from delivery and policy was very writ large. So we have a number of opportunities for this to be a partnership, for communicators to be working with others, to be working with citizens, and to be working with colleagues in policy and delivery areas. Getting closer to our audiences via interactivity and enabling participation. Delivering successful behavioural outcomes, I come on to talk about that a lot more in a second, and making government work better. So in terms of connecting with our audiences, one of the things that is undoubtedly changing our world to a degree that we don't understand the scope of yet is the opportunity that the internet, digital channels offers to us. Up here, I've just got a couple of little examples about things. You may not be able to read it from where you are, but the big text box is the Innovation Nation interactive consultation, where DIAS, no longer with us, as a department, was actually really at the cutting edge of how might we use the opportunities of the internet, Web 2.0, to engage better with citizens. So what you see on this chart is that within this white paper, I think it was, that they published, they didn't just say at the end, please send us back your comments. On each section of the white paper, you could post your comments against that section. And not only that, but officials who'd been working on the white paper would respond. So the bottom box down here is an official responding to, an official mark, not a press officer or a communicator, an official responding to a citizen making a suggestion about how a different way that something could be done within this context. Now, I think that's quite radical. I think that puts policy officials in a different space to where they've been before. I think it's got challenges, I think it's got risks, but I think it's also got very significant opportunities. Social media, the bottom box here is a guide that Cabinet Office and COI produced to engaging with social media. And again, huge opportunities, also comes with very significant risks. We've seen stories recently about public servants having anonymous blogs and how when they've been discovered or exposed for running those blogs, that they've been disciplined for it. But we also see areas where civil servants are writing non-anonymous blogs or stuff on comment boards, which is actually very helpful to the work of the department. If you've never been there, have a go at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office's website. They have blogs from our ambassadors and consular staff all over the world. One of the ways that the story of Zimbabwe was told most effectively was a blog by our man in Zimbabwe at a time where the BBC were not allowed into the country. Now, that's a very personal thing. That isn't written anonymously from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. That is written by our staff and attributable to them. So we've produced some guidance. What I can tell you is that that guidance will need to be rewritten in a year's time because the world will have changed again. What that guidance tells you or helps you to think about is what of yourself should you reveal through Facebook, for example. If you have a blog, how might you think about how you refer to your work in doing that? All of it, I think, helps the citizen to better understand government, but clearly within government we have to have rules about what things are disclosed and how they're discussed with citizens. All very tricky stuff, and it's not just communications. The people who are doing the engagement through this are people who understand their stuff. They are policy people, and that's where the richness comes from it. So, working together to achieve our goals, in terms of government, policies, communications and service delivery, the influences on behaviour give us some external factors, some situation and context, some individual factors and some social influences which get us to some outcomes. And I'm going to talk about some campaigns, particularly in the social policy area, particularly in health, and how I think they exemplify the ways in which government is using communication and behaviour change techniques to make some of this stuff happen. So, delivering real behavioural outcomes in partnership. Change for Life. I always hesitate before telling this story because it does cast me in not the greatest light ever. I was the Director General for Communications at the Department of Health 4 years ago or so, when the Permanent Secretary went before the Health Select Committee to talk about obesity. And the best he could do was to say that what we know about obesity is that you need to eat less and exercise more, and if every child ate one packet fewer of crisps a week, we wouldn't have a problem. And it didn't land very well with the Health Select Committee. What that triggered partly was a very big piece of work, which is not just some nice marketing stuff. It was a very big piece of work which started with the question, what insight can we gain into which people become obese and why they become obese, and where they make decisions in their lives that mean that that happens. And what the Department of Health got into, ages before anybody started looking at creative media campaigns, what the Department of Health got into was some really detailed work about consumption patterns, about what we knew about which types of children became obese, the ages at which they became obese, what we knew about their history. So it turns out that one of the significant indicators for a child going on to become obese is whether they breastfeed or not. What all of that means is that Change for Life is not actually a communications campaign at all. Communications people are absolutely dead in the centre of it. Change for Life is an obesity campaign built on insight which has a media element to it. It also has a whole bunch of stuff which is working with midwives and health visitors around encouragement to breastfeeding. It has a whole bunch of stuff which is about encouraging physical exercise. You know, at my local gym, you can join for a free first month and 50% off your gym membership, provided you fall into certain of the Change for Life categories. So there's a whole bunch of stuff which isn't communication activity at all, but is founded on some techniques, particularly around insight, that are things that marketeers have been using for years and years and years in terms of new product development and marketing, particularly commercial products. Again, some more things that lead to some real behavioural outcome changes. Now, these ads are all around the smoking campaign. You may well have seen some of them. The one in the top right-hand corner with the clown is voiced by a child, and it says, "I'm not scared of clowns, but I am scared of my mummy dying." What we've got to with smoking is probably the greatest case study of all time on how you achieve behaviour change. The great thing about smoking is that we know that it's not a grey issue. Smoking is a bad thing. There is no context in which smoking is a good thing. Therefore, it is easy to seek to change that behaviour because there's no area in which it might be good. But what that leads you to is needing insight into why people smoke, which people are more likely to smoke, and what are the things that might make them not smoke. And you can only achieve that through getting that insight, something that, as I say, communicators are used to doing. But this is all led by smoking policy people. It's not led by communicators. Some of the outcome may be an advertising campaign, but it's only one part of a suite of interventions designed to change behaviour around smoking. Similarly, other campaigns that are similarly based on insight and part of their outcome is around a communication message, but partly it isn't. The Think campaign from the Department for Transport around teenagers and road safety, again, based very much on not, oh dear, teenagers are getting run over, but some insight that said, what is it about teenagers that mean that they are proportionately more likely to be involved in a road accident? What is it and what can we do about that? And again, communication is only part of that. You'll have seen the important information about swine flu, which I hope came through your doors. That was part of a very big campaign. Government priorities and the role of communications. The Prime Minister has talked about 3 priorities for the next period: supporting people through the recession and building a strong recovery. Now, for me, one of the issues for us about this is that the way we arrange our support to people who are suffering in a recession is departmental. If you work for the Department for Communities and Local Government, then you are responsible for the Homeowner Mortgage Protection Scheme. You're responsible for some of the work around preventing repossessions. If you work for the Department for Work and Pensions, you're doing a huge amount of work at the moment on trying to get people back into work quickly. If you work for BIS, then you are supporting businesses which may be finding it difficult in the recession and so on. Now, all of that is fine in terms of delivering services, and we've done some quite good work around what services need to be delivered to people. But in a communication sense, my worry is that if you are suffering from the recession, you're unlikely to be suffering from one thing in isolation. If you've lost your job, you are probably likely to be concerned about your housing situation as well. And yet we as government too often communicate from a departmental basis. We say, here's some help with your house. And the worry is that what we give people is multiple different messages from different departments. And I think one of the things that we as government need to do better is to coordinate with our messages across departments in the same way we need to coordinate policy across departments. Reforming and modernising public services, building Britain's future. Many of you will have been aware of the launch last week, a whole raft of stuff looking to do that. And restoring trust and accountability. And for me, really interesting example here of the interplay between communications and policy. What are you trying to achieve in terms of restoring trust and accountability? Because you can put an awful lot into constitutional renewal, but I suspect that votes at 16 and fixed-term parliament are not going to be seen by the majority of the public as fixing MPs' expenses. So in terms of the communications, we may have policies which are in theory a good thing, but do they actually meet a government policy objective? And I think working communicators, as has been happening, working very closely with policy officials on restoring trust and accountability will be very important. In terms of government priorities, let's say supporting people through the recession and building a stronger economy. Some of it is quite traditional government department work. DWP, I mean, I'm not decrying it. It's fantastic marketing and so on. But some of it is thinking more widely and linking very much to a policy objective. So Alan Sugar and the apprenticeship scheme, I did a little drop-in centre on the civil service stand earlier. Nobody dropped in because they were all watching Alan Sugar. So should I be disappointed that Alan Sugar's a bigger draw than me? I don't think so. And Act on CO2. Really interesting, I think, in terms of the link between a policy, which is around our carbon footprint, and how we get people engaged with that policy, which is partly about marketing, but it's also about insight into what makes people want to do those things. Reforming and modernising our public services and national infrastructure, it's not, we haven't just come to this with Building Britain's Future. The NHS has been doing a huge amount of it and a huge amount of engagement with the public. Our NHS, Our Future, is very significantly about a change in the way that the NHS engages with its doctors and nurses rather than a change in the policy on the NHS. And I think it's very interesting to me that that was driven by doctors and nurses and not by communicators. I spent quite a long time at the Department of Health trying to tell the Department of Health it should engage more closely with doctors and nurses. Actually, what changed it was doctors and nurses taking control of that and doing it for themselves. And finally, government priorities, restoring trust and accountability, and using some of the really interesting techniques we can now use on the internet to do things like, this is the new opportunities page, where it isn't just government telling you stuff, it's a chance for citizens to tell their own stories. So it's not just government space broadcasting to people, it's a chance for citizens to play into that space at all. The Science So What page, another one that enables citizens to interact with government in that way, which I think helps to restore some of that credibility. So for me, as I say, we're on a journey. We're on a journey where I think communicators in government are changing their roles. I think policy and delivery officials are changing their roles, particularly with relation to communications. I don't think we're all going to end up doing each other's jobs, but I think the nature of our roles will change because we need to position ourselves in terms of engagement with citizens and communications differently. That will mean that we have one strategy for a piece of work, not multiple strategies for a piece of work. It will mean that we are all using insight as a basic technique for policy or delivery and then for communications, and that we have a common understanding of insight. I think it will always mean that our engagement with citizens is intended to be as interactive as possible. I think it will mean that where we're working with public services, the experience of those at the front line and of those who consume public services will be an absolutely essential part of how we design those services. And I think the developments that we will see with social media will be absolutely crucial to that. And I think what we now know is that things that look a bit faddish to start with are often things which grow into something really quite interesting. I was a great skeptic about Twitter to begin with, and I think Twitter is now very close to being a pretty core piece of communication. As a communications professional, I think the discipline of getting a thought or a message into 140 characters is absolutely fantastic. And I guess if I leave you with one challenge, other than think about how your work as policy delivery communications people works in relation to each other. My one challenge to you is that the next time you come to be launching a big piece of work or delivering a new project, think about how you Twitter it. What's the 140 characters that defines the piece of work that you've just done? So I shall finish there, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Civil Service Live.